Hello and welcome to this new episode of the Windhorse Publications podcast. My name is Dharma Mega and I'm very pleased to have had the chance to interview Vishvapani today, author of the recently published book Reimagining Buddhism, Understanding Sangharakshita and His Teachings. So, as you may know, Sangharakshita is a central figure in contemporary Buddhism as a thinker and also as the founder of what is now the Triratna Buddhist Order and movement. And Vishvapani's book offers a fresh reading of Sangharakshita's life and work. It approaches him as an imaginative thinker who sought to return the Buddhist tradition to its founding inspiration. So in this interview, Vishvapani talks about his own relationship with Sangharakshita and the ways in which Sangharakshita worked with Buddhist and Western concepts and images. And as you'll see, Vishvapani argues that despite criticisms of Sangharakshita, his depth of thought and experience, his independence, his audacity should be taken seriously. So I hope you'll enjoy the conversation and the thoughtful ways in which Vishvapani talks about Sangharakshita's life and work and its place in the wider movement of Buddhism beyond Asia. So it's really great to have you on the podcast, Vishvapani.
It's great to be here.
So some of our listeners will know you or know your name, probably either because of your work for the BBC Thought of the Day. You're a regular contributor to that, or more broadly because of your book Gautama Buddha, which is one of my favorite books about the Buddha, actually, which has done really well by Quercus Books a couple of years ago. Well, quite a long time ago now. I can't remember when it was published.
Published the end of 2011. So quite a long time ago, 14 years ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has done well and people are still reading it and it's still out there and alive.
And today we're here to talk about your most recent book, which is very, very fresh off the press and published just in time for the celebrations which were held on the 26th of August for Sangharakshita's centenary. And the book is called Reimagining Buddhism, Understanding Sangharakshita and His Teachings. So maybe we start a bit at the beginning. Who are you in relation to Sangharakshita and who is Sangharakshita in your life?
So I'm Vishvapani, and Vishvapani is a Sanskrit name. It's not the name I was born with. It's the name I was given when I was ordained into the Triratna Buddhist Order, or the Western Buddhist Order as it then was, in 1992. And that's the core of a Buddhist movement called Triratna. And well, the movement has a founder. And what that means is that as a member of the order, I have a Buddhist teacher, and his name is Sangharakshita. So, sometimes people get to know me or order members without knowing the background. But I've learned my Buddhism primarily from Sangharakshita. I've learned how to practice Buddhism, particularly through Triratna and Sangharakshita and others in Triratna. But really, that's our lineage. It's through him. Of course, I know, I'm a reasonably well-read Buddhist. I know lots about Buddhism, but the living spirit of it has come to me from him, which I recognize now.
And you had a kind of personal relationship with Sangharakshita. You knew him not just through his writings, but as a person, and you spent time with him.
Yes. So I lived for 6 years at a place called Majjhimaloka, which was then the headquarters of Triratna, or what the Friends of Western Buddhist Order, as it was then called. And it was a large house in suburban Birmingham, very large. And there were quite a lot of senior people in the order living there. And Sangharakshita lived there in a sort of annex, a granny flat. And for the first 3 years, he joined us each evening for an evening meal and discussion. And, those were rather formal settings sometimes, but it was a way to get to know him. And then, I was around him. I was, I'd meet with him, sometimes go for a walk with him. He was getting old at that stage, and then he got quite ill while I was there. And, so I was getting to know him in different ways. And it's, but he was always a rather distant figure. We had a friendship, but it was never particularly close, intimate, warm friendship. But I suppose, just more broadly than that, as I've got older myself, I recognize the effect, the many ways in which he's influenced my life. And actually, I think that goes for everyone who's involved in our Buddhist movement. Whether we realize it or not, we are imprinted and deeply influenced by Sangharakshita.
So this book is not actually a biography of Sangharakshita. I mean, he lived a very long and interesting life in the UK where he was born, and in India in various places, and then back again. So we actually, he himself wrote quite a lot of memoirs, and quite recently Windhorse Publications published a book that was more a biography of Sangharakshita. What is this book if it's not a biography?
Well, Sangharakshita, I will sometimes slip into calling him Bhante because, out of force of habit, because that's what we call our teacher, Sangharakshita. So Bhante put so much of himself into his teachings, both as a writer. He wrote many, many books, and as a lecturer, and many books of those books have been published. And now there's this massive, truly enormous, complete works, which I believe you had something to do with overseeing, Dharma. So he's this vastly prolific person, and I think and he needs to be taken seriously, both because of the breadth and quality of his writing, but also because of its depth. Its spiritual depth. And so I wanted to encompass his work and say something about it. But something I think that I realized increasingly as I was writing was that it's not a body of work that you can boil down to a set of abstract ideas, or even a process of intellectual development. Someone recently described the book as an intellectual biography. I suppose it has that aspect. But what I really wanted to do was to show how these teachings are an expression of a certain spiritual experience and spiritual life, and that he's trying to communicate an experience of spiritual life, of the Dharma, through those teachings so that other people can experience that for themselves. So in terms of, I suppose you're asking what genre does it fit into if it's not a biography? That I think, I like to read literary writings, writings about writers. And there are many books that aren't exactly biography, but they aren't a sort of critical study, literary criticism. Some things that go in by the name of biography are also deeply engaged with someone's work. And they, the ones that I like best are ways to get to the heart of what a writer is. Sometimes you read a biography of poet or something like that, and you think, yeah, okay, that's all very interesting, but what was it that actually enabled them to write that poetry, and what was going on with them in the act of creation? What were they expressing, and where did it come from? So I'm in that realm, and also what's interesting in the life, what's of lasting significance, not simply the details of the life, but the deeper currents within it, that really lead to a process of understanding. So actually, I don't think anyone has written a book like this about a contemporary Buddhist teacher. I can't think of one. But there are lots of books a bit like this about different writers and thinkers and, cultural figures and all that sort of thing. So I don't think I'm doing anything groundbreaking in that sense, but it's it is approaching Bhante Sangharakshita as that kind of as a thinker, a spiritual figure who asks us to kind of somehow approach their depths, and that's not very easy. But I found models.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose aside from the question of genre, I was also trying to get a little bit at why it's obviously been a very compelling and engaging project for you, and rightly so. I mean, I've had the chance to read this book a number of times now in its development, and it is an extraordinary piece of work to cover poetry and prose writing and sort of historical and comparative elements, to look at not really the psychology, but the sort of depths or motivation of Sangharakshita, as you say, and also to try and bring that into relationship to all these different kinds of thought that influenced him. It's quite an extraordinary piece of work. I'm wondering what motivated you to lock into that project quite so.
Well, I think the motivation is always personal, always, for these things. It has to mean something to you. I started off not really thinking of it like that. I started off thinking, this would be helpful for other people who, because there's so much of it and you need an overview, or for within Triratna, what are the kind of core principles that in that teaching that we can follow? And I haven't lost sight of either of those aims, but I think there's got to be something more personal, because it's, what is it that appeals, that speaks to me in this work? It speaks to me more than other Buddhist teachers. I think it's more than just circumstantial. This is the one that I found. It's about a certain understanding, a sensibility. And so I wanted to distill that for my benefit, but also I think that is what's relevant to other people as well. That's what we're engaging in. If I could get it right, but then frankly, the process of engaging with someone with so much depth and so much learning was quite overwhelming, and just trying to do justice to this massive and magnificent body of work, sometimes contradictory, sometimes not uneven, let's say that, with so many forces at work within it. So to try to offer an imaginative map of that was quite a compelling, and I have to say, overwhelming project, which I make no claim to have succeeded in, by the way.
So I've really appreciated the work that you did in this book to look more closely at what Sangharakshita took to be the significant elements of, let's call it, Western culture that he brought into relationship with Buddhism in his act of translating Buddhism from his experience in Asia to a new movement, which initially was called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. And you particularly draw out his relationship with Romanticism, Neoplatonism. Those are big words, a bit abstract. What I'm trying to get at is a lot of the work that you did was sort of this archaeology of his influence. Maybe we can start there. What influenced him?
Okay, so perhaps I should set the scene for Sangharakshita starting to teach in the West. So he'd already been a Buddhist monk and teacher in India for 14 years, but really he'd been in Asia for 20 years, and he was very, very widely read. So he was very widely read in Western art and literature, and extremely widely read in Buddhism. And I think the way he would put what he was trying to do when he arrived and started to respond to the people who were there, the young people who came to his lectures, his classes, initially at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, where he was there in his yellow robes, and later in the Friends of Western Buddhist Order when he started the Buddhist movement. So the main thing I think he would say is that he was trying to distill something from this array of Buddhist schools that was universal. And that's really the theoretical work that he'd been doing in his writing in India. So something that was more intrinsic than any of the particular expressions of Buddhism that we find in Asia. And then he wanted to express that, re-express that. And I use the phrase reimagine, to reimagine that for the modern world, for a Western culture, which I know that the language Western culture has become problematic these days because we live in a multicultural society and world. But that was how he saw it at that point 50 years ago, very clearly, that we were 60 years ago, that he was wanting to re-express Buddhism in terms that made sense to people. And what he then did was to draw on his own deep connections with Western culture. So, yeah, you mentioned Romanticism, Neoplatonism, come on to those. But I think that the fundamental way to understand Sangharakshita, that want to know what kind of person he was, is to say that he felt himself to be fundamentally opposed to the modern world, to modernity, with, whatever that might mean. And that's partly why he'd gone east. I mean, actually, the British Army took him there initially, but it's why he stayed there. And he left behind the world, but particularly the Western world. He went native. The Raj administrators would have been very worried about him. And he was, in that sense, he saw modern Western post-industrial society as being, quite profoundly alienating, something that set us at odds with who we are, that introduced a rationalistic, utilitarian, mechanistic way of thinking that cut us off from a sense of the world, the universe, as imbued with meaning, with potentiality, with spiritual values. And in that sense, he followed a long tradition of people in the West, and he recognized that heritage. So what I just described is what you could call Romanticism. That is the Romantic Revolution against the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution from between, let's say 1790 to 1830, but then continuing through many of the people who Sangharakshita was reading, philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, people like Madame Blavatsky, the poetry of that era that continued down as a sort of countercultural tradition to the period when Sangharakshita was forming his own mind and imagination. And then behind Romanticism are other alternative traditions to, that's what he called them in one of his books, alternative traditions, forms of spirituality, spiritual life that have been there that weren't just opposed to those aspects of modernity, but were also distinct from the mainstream Christian tradition. So he drew on what's called the Hermetic tradition, of esoteric wisdom, and I won't try and unpack all of these things, but these are Western mystical traditions. And William Blake is a good example of someone who's in the first Romantic tradition, but with many affinities to Neoplatonism and also a kind of prophetic biblical tradition. And Sangharakshita inherited that. And because he was so well read, he knew that he was inheriting those things. And those were all informing his re-expressions of Buddhism. He also drew in that period, in the late 60s, on Carl Jung, who himself drew on the Neoplatonists and on the Romantics. So he was finding language for what's missing. He spoke in that period a lot about archetypes, myth, the imagination, all of that, as well as the Buddhist language of which was his main vocabulary. And he was trying to express what Buddhism had to say in a way that was alive in the 1960s, when, of course, there was this countercultural movement, which it seems to me you can see as a continuation of that Romantic rebellion. And he was speaking to the times, but very much from his own personal set of connections.
The title of the book, and one of the main things you start off with, is the importance of image and imagination, and the array of metaphors, a lot of which are about growth, that come both. There's sort of an overlap, isn't there, between Buddhist language around growth and development, and the images that really moved Sangharakshita as a person and in his poetry, and formed such a strong language for him in that teaching. Are those the language of Neoplatonism or Romanticism? You've outlined a little bit their historic development, but what does that feel like in his teachings? What does it matter that his teaching was in that language, or was that language?
Well, I don't want to make too much of Sangharakshita the Romantic, because I think he was, if you want to locate him culturally, but he was. His main focus was Buddhism, and when he came in his teaching in the West, the central part of his teaching is really the lectures and seminars that he gave in the, I don't know, maybe 20 years after his return in 1964 from India to the West. So in that period, he's really engaged with a body of people. He's developing a Buddhist movement. He has this sort of inspirational quality about him. He believes that what he's doing is capable of changing the world. He really believed that it could somehow heal the rifts within Western culture. And the core of his teaching, or probably at least the thread that I draw out in my book, is his sense of spiritual life as a process of growth and development, organic development, seeing things as a whole, being a whole person, and developing like a flower from a seed which contains the essence of something much greater than itself. And then a steady process of unfoldment, which requires all of the conditions, an array of conditions. It requires, a plant requires sun and water and nutrients, and a human being to develop require a balanced spiritual life. We require friends. We require a supportive community. We require a lifestyle that supports our practice. So in that sense, he thought, well, the spiritual life is a steady, progressive process where we have to put a lot of energy into establishing the conditions so that growth can occur in quite a natural way. So you could see that as a kind of romanticism, but that feels a little compartmentalized. It's really, for Sangharakshita, it was a faith that that's what human life really is, which he found expressed within Buddhism. That, maybe I'll leave it there. I haven't said anything about Neoplatonism, but that's quite enough for now.
Well, I think just that was a lovely way of unfolding, so to speak, that vision of if human beings are like plants and our spiritual development is like that, what are the conditions that are needed? And of course, in a way, his teaching is very practical. He's got these metaphors, and then it is very practical in that way. And I'm sure you and I have personally benefited from imagining ourselves that way and receiving the kind of support that the Sangha creates.
I've thought of a segue into Neoplatonism, if you like.
Go on.
You're speaking that what's the space that the plant grows into? And so very important for Sangharakshita is the sense that as well as the ordinary level of experience that comes through the senses, there's another dimension of existence, which he calls the vertical dimension. So he's often talking about horizontal and vertical. And the vertical, that's where he makes connections with traditions like Neoplatonism, which had this sense of a higher level of reality. But he finds it really all the way through Buddhism. And he makes a very strong case for it, over many, many pages. And anyone who disputes it will have to dispute the case that he makes. That, it gives that's the basis of the poetic element and the imaginative aspect of his teaching, that anything that we might experience in the present moment has this wider significance, this deeper meaning, this greater resonance, if we can but see it through an act of the imagination. And art is trying to encourage us to do that. It's showing us how to do that.
There's a whole sort of cluster of words and associations that we use, ideas of spiritual hierarchy, of levels, whether that's levels of going for refuge, for example, and the transcendental. All of these are kind of, I would imagine, in that area, that there is something of a vertical dimension, whether that's high or low, that he's using that metaphor really, really strongly.
So there's that language is sort of geometry, axes and levels, and there's a transcendental, and so there's a kind of shape that Sangharakshita's thought have, which is a bit geometrical in some aspects, but he really then steps back from that and says, you can't think about this stuff like you're an architect. You have to think of it as if you're a gardener. He used that in terms of how he was developing this Buddhist movement. And so really this is the kind of intellectual underpinnings, which you don't necessarily have to bother about if you just want to practice or read or something. But he is putting those two ways of thinking together, the sense of there's something ascending and then there's something growing.
And beauty is a mark of that.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I mean, how do we get a sense in our lives that there's more to existence than what daytime TV shows us, Well, that may not be that hard, actually. It might be, maybe I'm being a bit flippant, but it's those moments of, or those periods where we encounter beauty. And what is beauty anyway? It's something that we respond to emotionally, imaginatively, with the whole of ourselves. And we might experience it in art, in nature. We might experience it in our inward experience. We might experience it in another person. But there's a sort of opening, which, philosophers have often tried to approach, and you don't want to conceptualize it too closely because you dissect it. We murder to dissect. So Sangharakshita, I think, is very good in his teaching, in doing justice to that without conceptualizing it too rigidly. And often when you read his work, he offers you a formulation, and then he steps back from it and he tells you everything that's wrong with that formulation, how it over literalizes things. And so then he goes to a metaphor. And sometimes he just keeps going with the metaphor, but quite often he'll say, even that metaphor has got its limitation. So it's, you have that kind of shifting of perspectives in his writing. And he tells you again and again that the reason I'm doing this is that we're dealing with something that's quite indefinable. All experience is indefinable. So whatever definitions we offer, we need to use tentatively, metaphorically, figuratively. And that's really his mark as a thinker.
I think one of the reasons why I'm wanting to follow some of these threads that we're talking about is that it's not many people who've gone into Sangharakshita's writing in this way and actually helps to bring forth some of the deep logics. And I don't just mean logics, conceptual logics, but the deep sort of heart and symbolic logics and the historical logics of how he has what we talk about maybe is his presentation of the Dharma. So there's lots of other lovely conversations around Sangharakshita and his imagination and images that we've been having, and you'll be having those conversations. But I suppose we have a bit of a chance here to explore some of the uniqueness of the work that you've done in making this book. So I just really appreciated that myself, to understand a bit more the breadth of the influences and how they shaped his thinking. I mean, one of the things, just as you're speaking now, we're talking about friendships, we're talking about art, talking about poetry. We're not only talking about meditation.
No, we're not talking about meditation. That's one of the things he's sometimes criticized for. That if you look at how most Western Buddhist teachers have functioned, they've led retreats and they've taught meditation. And not all of them, but Sangharakshita tended not to do that. In fact, he didn't do that. He didn't lead meditation retreats. He kind of thought, well, that's fairly easy. Other people can do that. His vocation was to immerse himself in the texts, immerse himself partly through meditation, but also through reading, and then to unfold the various expressions of Buddhist wisdom for his students through lectures and through the many, many seminars that he undertook, and then to guide a Buddhist movement to show how people could live out what he was teaching. So, he valued meditation. He saw it as a central practice, but I think he often felt that there was an undue emphasis among Western Buddhists on meditation practice, as if that is the real thing. And when people say my Buddhist practice, they actually mean meditation. And maybe that's because, for various historical reasons, we tend to associate a search for meaning with experience, personal experience, an inward experience, and we devalue things like ethics, things like community. And I think when I speak to Buddhists in different traditions, very often the more experienced ones have been on some kind of journey that's led them to recognize the value of those things, particularly community. And often they struggle to really find one that supports them in the way that they would like.
I wonder if it's a good time now to actually not necessarily in a pejorative form, but in a sort of historical and sociological way, look at how Sangharakshita and the FWBO actually, how is it different in character or form to other kinds of translations, whether that's sort of, say, Thich Nhat Hanh, so Asian Buddhists who are in the West, or Shambhala, for example, or people who are born in the West who've gone to Asia and learned, let's say, in the Insight Meditation Society, for example. You do some comparison in your book with just the different kinds of structures and approaches.
I do make that comparison. So the first thing to say is, in comparison with almost all the other main teachers, is that Sangharakshita didn't simply pass on one particular Asian lineage, Zen or Theravada or Tibetan Buddhism. He had experience of all of those things, to varying degrees. He was a Theravadan monk, had Theravadan ordination, but then he was living in the Himalayas with around many Tibetans, including some very great teachers. So he had experience of those things, but his own starting point was really quite distinctive. It was a faith that Buddhism is a unity, that he read the Diamond Sutra when he was 16, and that has a transformative effect upon him. And then he read the discourses of the what we call the Pali Canon, where he felt that he was hearing the words of the Buddha, the historical Buddha. So these are very different Buddhist traditions. One passed on by the Theravada, another passed on by the Mahayana. So he wanted to be able to accommodate all of those things, and this is one of the problems that some people have with Sangharakshita. He felt he could discern what was Buddhism among all of this stuff. So others might agree in theory that there's something that unites them. But Sangharakshita felt, I can say what that is. I can name it. I can identify it doctrinally, and I can re-express that. I can live that out in my experience. I don't need to be, even though he, towards the end of his time in India, became a very close personal disciple of various Buddhist teachers, was receiving initiations from them. He didn't then think, I am this person's disciple. I will pass on the teachings of the Nyingma school, of the Nyingma or the Gelug school, as a Westerner. No, he thought, I will pass on my understanding of the teachings. And that initially made him very unpopular. I'm not even sure it was really tenable to try to do that through Buddhist institutions which had their own affiliations. But that is what he wanted.
Are you speaking about in India particularly, or
No,
also when he came back?
All right. He in India it was fine because the Tibetans accepted him as a Westerner. Wasn't as someone who wasn't born into their traditions, and it was before the great wave of Westerners getting ordination and becoming students of Tibetan monks. They just accepted him, and he was. He was affiliated to something called the Mahabodhi Society, which was set up to preserve the lineage, preserve Buddhism in a non-denominational way, drawing on all the different schools of Buddhism. And he was the editor of the Mahabodhi Journal, the journal of the society. So in a way, he was able to function quite easily in that respect in India, and people accepted him on his own terms as an independent figure. But when he came to the West, initially he started teaching at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, which was, according to some people at least, a Theravadan institution. So there he was, the most senior Theravadan bhikkhu in the West, or at least in England, and not wanting to teach standard Theravada, not even wanting to teach standard Mahayana, if such a thing exists, but to teach his own modern version of it. And that's one reason why they simply could not accept him and he was thrown out. There are other reasons as well. But that one, actually, I think is quite an understandable reason for his critics, which has never really been acknowledged within Triratna. But, you know, do you want to be anyway, it's obvious, I've made the point, but
it's quite an extraordinary and audacious move to found your own Buddhist movement and initiate an ordination lineage.
It shows a remarkable degree of self-confidence. His critics would call that arrogance, but at the same time, many other people have founded new iterations, new kinds of Buddhist order in the West. And I think, if you think of Thich Nhat Hanh founding the Order of Interbeing, Chogyam Trungpa, who you mentioned, starting the Shambhala movement with its own lineages, non-monastic. Well, actually, there is a monastic lineage, but that's really rather peripheral within that movement. And a lot of people establishing new forms of Buddhism. Joseph Goldstein, who I also talk about, starting the Insight Meditation Society with a group of collaborators, and stripping Buddhism back to what he thought of as the essence, which this had been started in Burma and Thailand before, particularly in Burma. But the idea that mindfulness, simple mindfulness practice, and then meditation more generally, that is the essence of Buddhism. That's the way you get insight, and that's how you realize the goals of Buddhism. So there were lots of people doing that. But usually they were developing from an established tradition and adapting it, sometimes adapting it quite radically. But Sangharakshita wasn't doing that. And he was drawing on multiple traditions. Not many people have done that. He's not the only person to have done it, but not many others. And it raises the question for some people of whether that is a legitimate thing to do. Can you do that? Are you allowed to? And Sangharakshita just shrugged his shoulders when that was put to him and said, well, there aren't authorities within Buddhism that tell you what you can and can't do. My endeavor is to elucidate what Buddhism really teaches, and that's what I pass on. So he put it very, very simply, but it's not so simple if you look at it from the outside.
No. I mean, sort of getting a sense of the layers that you've done in this work, to get a sense of his character and his person and his inspiration. I mean, maybe going back to that question around the relative importance of meditation, it's clear in his own biographical material, and if you look at his own inspiration, as you do in your book, that he was a very strong meditator, was very inspired, and particularly by sort of sadhana and what you talk about as maybe actually we should come back to this, but what you talk about as positive, what in the sense of what we would talk about in shorthand as a spiral path, for example, or the emphasis not on a path of via negativa, not this, not that, a kind of a more canonical Theravadan path, but seeking out images of the positive, of growth, of friendship, of inspiration, of the vertical in this very positive language. That strikes me as something quite not necessarily unique, and maybe it's less and less unique over time as more Western traditions of Buddhism are rounding out, maybe.
Well, Sangharakshita found that in the Mahayana, and his central text, in going right back to when he was in India in 1957, was a survey of Buddhism. And in the survey of Buddhism, he makes two arguments, really. First of all, that I find it helpful to read focus on the second chapter, which isn't the bit that people in Triratna study most, where he talks about the Mahayana, and his sensibility was really much more attuned to the Mahayana. And he says that the Mahayana has this very positive way of expressing the Dharma. It teaches the Bodhisattva path, the path of one who's seeking enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, who's motivated by compassion, and who ascends, who develops these great perfections, and passes through the stages of a Bodhisattva path. And that's what really inspired him, the Bodhisattva ideal. And then you look back at what the Theravadins were saying about the Buddha, and it seems so much more narrow. Particularly at that time, the versions of Theravada that were around were quite rationalized and conceptual. And the concepts tended to be talking about what we have to let go of, what we have to renounce, what we have to abandon. And then nirvana itself, Buddhahood, becomes something that's defined through its negations. So that's very strongly present in the early sources, the discourses. But what Sangharakshita did, and he wasn't the only person to say this, was that there's something else even in those texts that shines through them, shines through this analysis and this negative expression. And that, he thinks, is the voice of the Buddha. And so then he has an account of the early Buddhist teachings, which is very selective, or a very strong interpretation, you could say, very strong reading, which emphasizes the positive elements in the early tradition. So for him, he believed that everything he said later was grounded in what the Buddha had taught, that had then been picked up by the Mahayana as a fresh expression of it, and that then, and what later generations had to do was to capture that vital living spirit, which was a spirit of growth and unfoldment and bringing then wisdom and compassion, which is the essence of Buddhism. And it's not really about the history, not really about who you've learnt it from. It's about those qualities of spiritual unfoldment. So, and actually, we know so little. I mean, this is something that's become clear to me more recently. We know so little really about the first few centuries of Buddhism, that the Theravadan claim that these scriptures are the verbatim word of the Buddha is not something that can just be taken at face value by any means.
So let's step back a little bit. We've been looking at Sangharakshita and his teaching and the movement that he founded, and its sort of distinctiveness, if you like, in relation to this cultural transmission of Buddhism to the West, or Buddhism into modernity, which may or may not overlap. And you've talked about how actually, he's founded something new. He's sought the unity of Buddhism. He's got this sort of emotional, spiritual, imaginal connections that have given a certain sensibility to his teaching. But in a way has been very effective. And maybe it's also time to look a little bit at some of the other areas that are a little bit more contested, both in terms of the forms of his teaching and his behavior, and the sort of the way in which his thought and sensibility and his behavior, particularly in relation to his sexual activity, and how do you deal with that in the book? It's not a there's a lot of questions in there, but maybe we can just maybe I'll hand it over to you as like how do you deal in the book with the criticisms of Sangharakshita, both from within the Triratna community and Sangha, and perhaps more widely? You've already spoken about the audacity to form a new tradition, but there are other elements as well, aren't there?
Yes. So Sangharakshita's reputation beyond Triratna is really clouded. And frankly, one of the reasons I wrote the book was that I think the questions over his particularly sexual behavior have prevented people from really considering who he is. And I think he's a much more significant person in the wider sphere of Buddhism in the West than is acknowledged. And I really think it's time to change that. I think we need to look directly for people within Triratna, be very frank about the problems that are there in regard to his sexual behavior, but also for others to look much more broadly at who he was and what he achieved, because it's unique and remarkable. Of course, the criticisms of his, or the mistrust of him founding a new iteration of Buddhism, goes along with those criticisms in people's minds, because if you're going to do something as audacious as that, then really you need to have the evident spiritual depth to be able to do it, to even be able to be taken at all seriously. And if someone is falling foul of what are our contemporary concerns, at the top of the list are all of the Me Too issues around abuse and so on. If you don't pass that test, then you are not worth looking at. So I think that's been overstated among the critics, but it's not to say there's nothing there. So I approach it a bit obliquely in the book, and then I do address it directly. But I think the context is this Sangharakshita's sensibility as a whole, and what he was trying to do when he brought Buddhism to the West. He's sometimes talked about as someone who was very much inspired by the heights, by the higher evolution and beauty and the transcendental. We've touched on all of that. But what goes along with that is a sense of needing to contact the depths, and that's also what archetypes and myth are about. They're about guiding us how to plumb the depths. And one of the things that I think was there in the depths of the sanguine, calm, contemplative bhikkhu who we encounter in India was a sort of frustrated sexuality. He talks about it sometimes, rather reticent to do so, but he does it enough to make it clear that that was a part of his experience. So he came to the West with this idea about a really wholehearted, full-blooded way of being and way of living. And there he was, a 40-year-old virgin. So, but rather passionate nature, and erotically passionate as well. So he then became sexually active, and often that was with his students. So for some people, that's the end of the discussion. Teachers who become sexually active with their students are inherently illegitimate. But I can't accept that at all. I don't think people are as neat as we might like them to be. And a lot of what happened was consensual sex, with, it may well be, and this is my general feeling, that going down that route was a big mistake of Sangharakshita's, and it does show a lack of wisdom in that respect. But he didn't see it like that. He just thought he was experimenting, exploring, having a bit of fun, maybe.
Do you think the sexual activity was inherently wrong? You're saying that it was unwise, or do you mean the choice of his partners in terms of his rank or status as their teacher? I know he didn't think of it in terms of rank, but just that bit.
Well, he didn't think of it in terms of rank, but there was rank.
Absolutely.
Or there was status anyway. And so that's
I was just clarifying what you were saying. Yeah, I was just clarifying what you were saying. Yeah.
Right. So but I think the mistake that Sangharakshita made was to think that it could be straightforward. It could just be on the periphery of the mandala, as he said. Well, when was sex ever straightforward? And it might have been straightforward for him in his own emotional world, although he also says that it was part of becoming a whole person and with all of these deep forces at work in his nature. But even if it was straightforward for him, it's a big jump to think it's going to be straightforward for other people. And it turned out to be not straightforward for some people. So then there's a question of whether that sort of status difference is a form of manipulation, power. And it's very, very hard to say, as someone who's been confronted with these issues of Sangharakshita over many years. It's really hard to say. I imagine that he probably did overstep here and there. But on the whole, I think he was simply trying to engage with people and have some, follow his inclinations, of course, but not to do that in a way where he parked his ethics, parked his sensitivity to them somewhere else, and then something else happened. So, I think I don't accept the view that Sangharakshita is not a legitimate person to consider because of his view is sexual behavior. I mean, another area is his views on gender, where, again, I have very little agreement with him. And I mean, that's maybe another subject which we could talk about at length, but it's worth just naming it. And then some of the ways in which those views impacted Triratna in its own culture, as they were kind of expressions magnifying his own blind spots and his own biases. All that worked out. But the reason that I, having experienced all of that, stayed involved with Triratna is that I think he had a much broader vision. He was a much broader person than those particular issues were about. And because I think he really did succeed in fostering a spiritual community that enabled people, his disciples, to develop real spiritual depth in their own lives and in their own ways, and collectively to have a community that has that kind of depth, where we are able to think about those things honestly and straightforwardly on the whole. So I set all of that. So for me, that's the context for the implications of Sangharakshita's sexual behavior. And And it's simply putting it into a kind of abuse narrative or, predator narrative. I mean, all of these terms that get used are just so crude and inaccurate and unfair and ill-informed. But if you go online, you'll find all of them.
What would you like Sangharakshita's legacy to be? I mean, they will obviously continue to be this thread of discussion, isn't it, about his behavior and the significance of it and how to live with that as a community, because the community is formed around his ideas, his thoughts, his poetry, his teachings, his character, his sensibility, all of that's in the mix. But what, aside from these things, would you hope could be taken seriously? I mean, that's part of the labor of your book, isn't it? To kind of say, actually, let's look again and more thoroughly at this man's teaching and contribution.
So within Triratna, I think, we face all of the problems, all of the challenges in the long term that every spiritual community, every religious organization faces. And the way I'd put that is that on the one hand, if we try to hold things too tightly, we try to cleave too tightly to saying Sangharakshita can do no wrong or something like that, and the wisdom of our community is to be mined from Sangharakshita only there, or something like that, then we will fall prey to precisely the problems that Sangharakshita identified in the Buddhist world, being rigid, formal, paying too much attention to externals. So we need to offset that by talking about the spirit rather than the letter, which is one of his terms, which I discovered comes from St. Paul, but there you go. The spirit rather than the letter. And although the letter is, of course, important, it's always important. The other danger, I think, for Triratna is that we become very, very diffuse. We think of ourselves as this, one of the terms we use is a free association of individuals. And, well, that's fine. But if individuals means being an individual means we follow our own interests and inclinations without a sense of the community and without a sense of our history and our lineage, then we'll just dissolve into, we'll be washed away by the various currents that flow through Western culture and Western Buddhism. And you see that happening. There's something's happening in American Buddhism. 2 years later, there's a big controversy about it in Triratna. And we really can't afford to do either of those things. So what is that spirit? And I think the challenge for the community is keeping that spirit alive. I think most experienced people in Triratna know that that's our challenge. And it's partly through practicing together in all the many ways that we have. But it's also, and this is the contribution that I wanted to make, recognizing how it is that Sangharakshita's work hangs together as a whole, as an attempt to express that spirit of Buddhism and to locate it in many aspects of the Buddhist tradition, opening those traditions up to us, but then translating it into something that we can share with people, who are rather different from ourselves. So what I try to do in Reimagining Buddhism is to show how the imaginative center of Sangharakshita's work, or the center of Sangharakshita's work, is an imaginative center, and that it's about that spirit, which he expresses through as a process of growth and development, a spiral conditionality, centrality of going for refuge, all of these formulations. So, and in the way that he cultivated development of a Buddhist movement. So beyond Triratna, again, I just would like people to recognize that that's what he was doing, that he was this great philosopher poet, this great scholar practitioner, whose work is on an epic scale, and who has taken something that's, I think, relevant to anyone wanting to draw on Buddhism in the West, which is to say, what's relevant now? And how can we avoid reducing the magnificence of the Buddhist tradition into some kind of rationalized package? And there aren't many people, in fact, there's no one who's tried to do that in the way that Sangharakshita did on that scale, reading hundreds of texts. And I should warn listeners that Sangharakshita's works, complete works, are published in 26 very thick volumes, plus a concordance, and that there's about as much to come. They should really be called the incomplete works, I'm afraid, Dhammamegha. There's a vast amount, but, what he's doing again and again is trying to find the sap, the core. And we need that. We need to be able to step outside of sectarian divides. We may need to be able to see Buddhism as a whole. We need to be able to see it in its own terms rather than in terms of, some modern conceptual framework through which we interpret it. That is how Buddhism will become alive. And whether people are practicing within a Theravadan or Tibetan tradition or Zen or something like that, they are part of a process of Buddhism arising in the West that is inevitably going to mean that the traditions mix and mingle in many ways, in multicultural ways. And if we are going to keep Buddhism as a deep tradition, all Buddhists need to be asking the question that Sangharakshita asked, which is, what is the spirit and the message at the center of all of this?
That was a great point to finish on, I think, Vishvapani. I think the notion of a depth of a tradition and all that's needed for any of us human beings to be able to encounter the depth of that tradition. So it's not, the depth of a tradition is not an idea. It's something much more than an idea, isn't it? It's a perspective, it's a wisdom, it's a capacity, it's a recognition, it's all of those things.
Yeah, it's a path to awakening. And the world needs it. And that's something else that Sangharakshita felt very strongly, maybe even a bit too strongly sometimes, that the world needs the Dharma. Or to put it in slightly less sectarian ways, I think we would all agree with, the world needs wisdom. There's lots of information, but where's the wisdom? The world needs compassion. There's lots of interconnection in our globalized world, but where's the compassion? So if the Dharma is about wisdom and compassion, then the world really needs it. And Sangharakshita is someone who devoted his life to trying to make that available. And yes, he deserves a wider hearing.
It strikes me also that he spent a lot of his time setting up the conditions for it to be available, that it's not just wisdom or compassion, it's people who can actually increasingly embody those qualities.
Yes, it is. It is. I suppose I'm thinking of having moved on from talking about Triratna, where in a way that's more obvious to us. to a wider message, which I just hope that we can find a way for it to be heard, not for the sake of Triratna's prestige or Sangharakshita's, but because we're rather like an image that Sangharakshita liked to use about people who'd preserved the Theravada and preserved the Pali Canon like monkeys sitting on a jewel heap. There's a lot to mine.
Thank you, Vishvapani. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close up shop for the day?
I can't think of anything else right now. Available from all good bookshops.
There you go. I mean, I just wanted to thank you actually for doing the work. There are not many people who there's not many people who would have wanted to write this book, and
I
even
was
fewer
one of the people who didn't want to write the book.
But it takes a very wide range of skills and interests to be able to, I suppose, match and digest and look at together, put into relationship the breadth of Sangharakshita's writing, as you say, philosopher, poet, scholar, monk. And I'm really grateful that you've done this work. And I think it's one of those books after Sangharakshita's death that will be a kind of a stepping stone into the next phases for Triratna and beyond of understanding his work and getting a handle on it. It's, for those of us who aren't going to read the however many 15,000 pages.
Even if you do want to read a chunk of that, I think you need a guide. We may need more guides and maybe simpler ones than the one I've written, to just make things available to people and show the connections between them and show the continuities within Sangharakshita's life. Because, you might do the Mitra study course if you're within Triratna and you study some of Sangharakshita's books and lecture series and so on. But then it's very hard to encompass the whole thing and see the threads running through it. And I mean, frankly, I'd hope that even people who are quite experienced with Sangharakshita's work will encounter something fresh in what I've done.
I'm sure that's true, Vishvapani. I'm sure that's true. So thank you. And I wish you all the best with the next while, as I know that you've got quite a lot of sort of public appearances talking about the book, and there are lots of ways in which people will be engaging with what you've written. And I'm sure you'll continue to be available for that conversation. So I just wanted to say thank you really for making the time and all of the work that I know work in the deadlines into and just making space for writing and everything that was needed to write this book. Not an easy one. So thank you.
Thank you.